A single lens, ground from glass in 10th century Arabia, set off a chain of events that led, step by step, epiphany by epiphany, to the socialist holocausts of the 19th and 20th centuries. Not a furious, goose-stepping Nazi, a lens. Today, we're recapping the full arc of the research series March to the Holocaust, specifically the 13 epiphanic thresholds that ratcheted humanity toward catastrophe, the fatal flaw in academia that made it all possible, and a preview of what comes next in the follow-on series, The Next Best Thing. By the end of this episode, you'll understand why the Holocaust was, according to this research, not an accident of politics, but an almost inevitable consequence of how knowledge spreads and how institutions fail. I've got someone here who has been deep in this material, and I want to start with the thesis itself, because it is genuinely provocative, so walk me in.
So the central argument of the series is this. The Holocaust should not be attributed primarily to a furious, goose-stepping Nazi. It should be attributed to a fatal flaw within accredited academia. And that flaw has a very specific shape. It's the consistent failure to maintain the integrity of peer review, which allowed hypothesis to be presented to the general public as settled science, over and over again, across centuries.
Wait, so the argument isn't Hitler was uniquely evil, it's the institutions that were supposed to catch bad ideas kept failing?
Exactly. And the research is very precise about this. It says that every time humanity crosses what it calls an epiphanic threshold, a moment of paradigm-shifting knowledge, dissonance among the intelligentsia results in social upheaval and attending human rights violations. And crucially, with each new epiphany, the severity of the resulting upheaval is amplified. It's a ratcheting mechanism.
A ratcheting mechanism. So each threshold makes the next one worse.
Right. And the series tracks 13 of these thresholds, all originating from a single invention, Ibn Sal's optical lens, quantified in 10th century Arabia. That's the starting point. Everything. Galileo's telescope, Van Leeuwenhoek's microscope, Malthus, Darwin, Pasteur, the Café Central meeting in Vienna, all of it traces back to that one invention.
That is a genuinely wild claim. And I mean that as a compliment because it forces you to actually follow the logic rather than just accept it. So let's do that. Let's walk through the arc. Where does it actually begin?
It begins with Ibn Sal quantifying optical lenses. From there, Galileo improves the telescope, and suddenly humanity can see things it was never supposed to see, the moons of Jupiter, the structure of the cosmos. And that immediately creates a schism, because what Galileo's telescope revealed did not match what the church had been teaching. And the research frames that schism as the opening wound, the first moment where the intelligentsia and religious authority began pulling in opposite directions.
And then Van Leeuwenhoek's microscope comes along almost immediately after.
Almost immediately. And now you're not just looking outward at the cosmos, you're looking inward at the invisible world. Microorganisms, things that had never been seen before. And again, what you find there does not fit the existing paradigm, so the schism widens. The research describes this as humanity coming unhinged, and that's not hyperbole, that's the actual framing.
So you've got this widening gap between what science is revealing and what religious and social institutions have been built on. And the research argues that gap is where the danger lives.
That's exactly it. And here's where the research does something interesting. It doesn't just chart the descent, it also charts the resistance. Because righteous men and women, as the research puts it, began fighting back against this march almost from the first.
Oh, interesting. Who are we talking about?
The first major example the research gives is James Oglethorpe and his plan for the American colonies. The research uses Oglethorpe as an example of someone who was actively trying to build a counterweight to the forces being unleashed by these epiphanic moments, a framework for equity and freedom. And then later, the American Civil War itself is framed in a way that most people have never considered.
How so?
The research calls the American Civil War the world's first war against pseudoscience, not just a war about slavery in the conventional sense, but a moral contest against the pseudoscientific justifications that were being used to defend it. And Ulysses S. Grant is framed as a heroic defender of wisdom and freedom, and specifically, his creation of the public education system is described as a deliberate attempt to stop the march toward catastrophe in its tracks.
That reframes both of those things completely. I've never heard the Civil War described as a war against pseudoscience before.
And the research is clear that even that heroic effort was not enough. The march continued, because in the background you've got Thomas Malthus falling into what the research calls the rabbit hole opened by Ibn Sal's lens, his paranoia about population growth. Then Charles Darwin, with what the research describes as his morphological dysphoria and sexual fixations. And then Louis Pasteur.
Pasteur is interesting because he's usually framed as unambiguously heroic. Germ theory, vaccines, all of that.
And the research doesn't dispute the importance of germ theory. What it tracks is the consequence. Because in 1905, Erwin Smith's proof of Pasteur's germ theory, the proof that diseases were not punishments from God but the biological consequences of pathogens, that moment is described as the final divorce between religion and science. And the research says, at that juncture, there was no way to stop the Holocaust.
Wow. So the proof that germs cause disease, something we celebrate as one of the great achievements of science, is also the moment the research identifies as the point of no return.
Because of what it meant for the relationship between science and religion. From 1905 forward, science would reign supreme among the world's intelligentsia. And the research notes that Mary Baker Eddy had actually tried to prevent this. She attempted to reframe religion, and specifically prayer, as a scientific process, sensing academia's encroachment on religious paradigms of investigation. But by 1905, that effort had failed.
So you've got this moment where science has won the cultural authority battle and religion has lost it. And then what happens?
What happens is that the few who were actually following empirical method were outpaced by those who published pseudoscience in what the research calls an orgy of intellectual ambition. And that sets the stage for what the research describes as the most consequential scene in the entire series.
Which is Café Central in Vienna.
Café Central in Vienna, 1910. The research takes us there and describes a clique of what it calls chin scratchers. Alfred Adler, Leon Trotsky, Joseph Stalin, Dmitry Mitrinovich, and Vladimir Ilyich Lenin in absentia, pontificating on all which was then accepted as science. In a thick cloud of opium smoke, they were planning a global war of extinction. The revolution to come, it was agreed, had to be sudden, violent, and catalytic.
And the target was the world's royalty, nobility, aristocracy, and bourgeoisie, to be eliminated in one fell swoop.
Exactly. And the research describes the proletariat, the class they were defining and championing, as the first and only species of hominid in history to be defined by science. Except, as the research puts it, it wasn't science, it was insanity.
And then there's the detail about the loner at the table across the room.
Yes. On the periphery of this coffee clutch was a loner named Adolph, soaking it all in from a table across the room and beginning to make plans of his own. The research frames this as the moment where all the threads converge. The pseudoscience, the failed peer review, the intellectual dissonance, the planning of mass violence, all in one room, all traceable back to Ibn Sal's lens.
That is an extraordinary image. And it also raises the question the research spends a lot of time on. Why did the institutions fail? Why didn't peer review catch any of this?
So the research offers two layers of diagnosis. The first is structural, a consistent failure of accredited academia to maintain the integrity of peer review. Hypothesis was presented to the general public as science instead of mere hypothesis, over and over again. That's the institutional failure.
And the second layer?
The second layer is what the research calls idolatry, and this is where it gets genuinely philosophical. The argument is that failures in peer review cannot, by themselves, explain the dissonance that attends epiphanic moments. Idolatry is the only diagnosis that explains it. When theologians are more devoted to their interpretations of Scripture than to manifest truth, that is a form of idolatry. When scientists are more devoted to their hypothesis than to manifest truth, that is also a form of idolatry.
So the research is essentially saying that scientists and theologians are making the same mistake, just with different objects of devotion.
Precisely. And the research goes further. It says that since everyone is, in some measure, both theologian and scientist, we are all susceptible to idolatry. We believe what we believe for reasons we are convinced are justifiable. And when those justifications are exposed as fallacies, we are hard-pressed to abandon our beliefs because we define ourselves too much by what we believe.
That's a really uncomfortable thing to sit with, because it's not pointing at the Nazis or the communists and saying those people were uniquely broken. It's saying this is a human pattern.
That's the whole point. And the research draws on what every major religion instructs and what peer review of science enforces, that we are our own worst counsel. Accepting that, the research says, is the most difficult challenge for any free-thinking individual to overcome, but it must be done.
And the research is clear that by the time those figures met at Café Central in Vienna, the march toward the Holocaust was nearly complete. All that was needed was a spark.
The spark being the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand and Duchess Sofia in Sarajevo. The research includes that in the arc, along with the pandemic of 1918, which it says set the world's intelligentsia up for World War II, and the discovery of chromosomes, which accelerated eugenic pseudoscience. And finally, Fleming's discovery of antibiotics, which defeated the invisible enemy, but by then, pseudoscience had already marched onward.
Fleming's discovery of antibiotics is described as promising to deliver a golden age for mankind. And yet the research says pseudoscience marched onward anyway.
Because the pattern doesn't stop. And that's the bridge to what comes next. The research concludes the series with a statement that is also a preface. By the time the founders of the 20th century's socialist movement met at Café Central, the march toward the Holocaust was nearly complete. And then it asks, what happened after Hitler's bunker stopped smoldering?
Which is where the next best thing comes in.
Exactly. The follow-on series is called The Next Best Thing, and it's described as tracking scientific developments and witnessing pseudoscience continue to evolve long after the Second World War. In the Allied West, the intelligentsia turned on itself in what the research describes as a sometimes justifiable, often violating Nazi hunt, while in their midst, the next best thing in human evolution was being cooked up under their noses.
And what is that next best thing?
According to the research, biofeminists took over where the National Socialist Workers' Party left off. Darwin's sexual selection was reiterated as biofeminism, and a devoted clique began advancing the latest fallacy precisely as the last had done in private colloquia insulated from peer review. The same pattern, the same structural failure.
That's a provocative claim. The research is drawing a direct structural parallel between the pseudoscience that led to the Holocaust and biofeminism.
It is. And the research is specific about the timeline. By the late 1980s, biofeminist curricula was being trialed in advanced placement programs in American high schools. Gaia theory went from being treated as a syncretic collage of indigenous mythology to a seriously considered theory of science, except, the research argues, it was not. Within the biofeminist movement, Gaia theory and its goddess matriarch served the same function that Atlantis and the Aryan race did for the National Socialist Workers' Party, as the foundational mythology justifying the pseudoscience.
So the research is saying the mythology changes, but the mechanism is identical.
Identical. And by the turn of the millennium, biofeminism had spawned the neo-pagan movement, seeking to legitimize and institutionalize Wicca, witchcraft, shamanism, and all manner of indigenous belief systems in a religious front opposing what the research calls the world's patriarchal religions, specifically naming Shinto, Hindu, Buddhist, Hebrew, Christian, and Muslim faiths.
And The Next Best Thing is expected to drop on Free BC podcasts in the coming months.
That's what the research indicates. And the framing of that series is consistent with the framing of this one. It's not a political argument, it's a structural argument about how pseudoscience propagates when peer review fails, and what the human cost of that failure looks like.
So when you step back from everything we've covered today, the full arc from Ibn Sal's lens to Café Central to the preview of what comes next, what does this research actually ask of the listener?
It asks something genuinely hard. It asks you to accept that you are your own worst counsel, that the same idolatry that drove theologians to defend interpretations over manifest truth, and scientists to defend hypotheses over manifest truth, lives in all of us, and that the only way to interrupt the pattern is to take peer review seriously, not just as an academic process, but as a personal one. To hold your own beliefs up to scrutiny, especially the ones you've built your identity around.
And the research is clear that this is not easy. It says accepting that we are our own worst counsel is the most difficult challenge for any free-thinking individual to overcome.
But it must be done. That's the exact language. Not it would be nice or it's worth considering. It must be done. Because the alternative, the history of what happens when it isn't done, is the series we just recapped.
Here's what this really comes down to, I think. This research series has done something unusual. It's taken the Holocaust, which we tend to treat as a singular, almost incomprehensible evil, and it's shown it as the predictable output of a system that was failing for centuries. 13 epiphanic thresholds, each one worse than the last, each one enabled by the same structural failure.
And that reframing matters enormously, because if the Holocaust was the inevitable consequence of a pattern, then the pattern can be interrupted. It's not about identifying the next Hitler, it's about identifying the next moment when hypothesis is being sold as science, when a clique is advancing a fallacy in private colloquia insulated from peer review, and asking the hard questions before the ratchet clicks forward again.
And the next best thing is going to argue that the ratchet has already clicked forward again.
That's the implication. The research ends with a line that I think is worth sitting with. Fleming's discovery promised to deliver a golden age for mankind, but pseudoscience marched onward. Because history marched on, the research says, so does the investigation.
And the closing provocation of the series is one of the most honest things I've read in a long time. Believe half of what you see.
Which is not cynicism. It's the research's way of saying, stay skeptical, stay curious, and do not let devotion to a belief, any belief, override your commitment to manifest truth. That's the lesson of 13 epiphanic thresholds. That's the lesson of Ibn Sal's lens.
We started this episode with a lens ground from glass in 10th century Arabia, and we've ended up at a warning about the next wave of pseudoscience already in motion.
The arc of this research is genuinely one of the most ambitious things I've encountered, not because it has all the answers, but because it refuses to let any of us off the hook. The Holocaust was not someone else's failure, it was a human failure. And the research is asking whether we're making the same kind of failure right now. And the answer, if the next best thing delivers on its premise, is going to be uncomfortable. But discomfort is exactly where this kind of reckoning has to live.
Look for the next best thing to drop on Free BC podcasts soon.